I'm Daniel Asian, president of the Center for American Culture and Ideas and professor of music composition at the University of Arizona. I welcome all of you to the Cultured Mind Forum on President's Day. I'm reminded that when I was young, there was not a President's Day, but rather both a Washington's birthday celebration and a Lincoln's birthday celebration. Sometime then these two were combined into one holiday and placed on a Monday so we could all have a 3-day weekend. So there you have a little historical context. The Cultured Mind Forum series presents speakers who talk about history, philosophy, culture, ideas, anything that is important to us as Americans and who we are, and I suppose what we stand for. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Yuval Levin, who is our speaker. Yuval is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, also known as AEI, where he also holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. The founder and editor of National Affairs, he is also a senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Dr. Levin served as a member of the White House Domestic Policy Staff under President George W. Bush. He was also executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics and a congressional staffer at the member, committee, and leadership levels. In addition to being interviewed frequently on radio and television, Dr. Levin has published essays and articles in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Commentary. He is the author of several books on political theory and political and public policy, most recently, and which is the subject of his talk tonight, A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. Know that if you have any questions, you may enter them into the Q&A block on your website, and we will then address them after Dr. Levin's talk. So at this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Yuval Levin to CACI's Cultured Mind Forum. Welcome, Yuval.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I appreciate it. It's great to be with you. It's particularly great to be part of this somehow I muted myself. It's a great honor for me to be part of the program and to be among your speakers. I have always enjoyed the opportunity to talk with people who are interested in the broad range of issues that ultimately contribute to making our country what it is, philosophical questions as well as political and cultural. I think ultimately the culture matters most. And in a way, that's what I want to talk with you about tonight. I want to use the opportunity I have to spend a little time with you to try to think about some of what it is that's gone wrong in American life in recent years and what we might do about it. That something has gone wrong, I think, is pretty clear, but in some ways exactly what it is actually isn't as clear as we sometimes think or pretend. We know that it's not just about the politics of the last few years, rough as those have been. We know it's not about the pandemic we went through a few years ago. We know it's not about inflation. All of those kinds of things have made it worse, but the it seems like it's something else. It's something deeper. We Americans are living through a social crisis. We can see that in everything from vicious partisan polarization to rampant culture war resentments to an upsurge of isolation and alienation and despair that sent suicide rates climbing and driven an epidemic of opioid abuse in parts of our society. Those deep dysfunctions in seemingly very different parts of our society's life seem to have some common roots. But exactly what are those roots? What is it that's gone wrong? I think part of the crisis, one of its symptoms in a way, is that we can't seem to get an easy handle on just what that is. Traditional kinds of economic concerns don't really cut it as explanations. They matter, and certainly some people have suffered serious economic challenges in recent years. But on the whole, the 21st century has not been a time of terrible economic performance for our society. And even in the years when things have gone well on that front, the kind of crisis that I'm getting at here did not let up. And other familiars of well being around health or crime or opportunity don't really offer obvious explanations either. So, what is it exactly that we've been complaining about? There are actually some people who argue that there isn't anything to complain about, or that the frustration and anxiety that seem to overwhelm us now are rooted in imaginary grievances, so that they themselves are actually the problem. Steven Pinker of Harvard has made this kind of argument in a couple of recent books. He reviews mountains of data on wealth and health and safety and choice, and he concludes that populist complaints on all sides of our politics are detached from reality. And worse than that, he says they're dangerous. He says, quote, indiscriminate pessimism can lead to fatalism, to wondering why we should throw time and money at a hopeless cause. And it can lead to radicalism, to calls to smash the machine or drain the swamp or empower a charismatic tyrant, end quote. But surely public frustration is not just some kind of self delusion, especially frustration that runs this deep and that's revealed itself in such a broad range of social symptoms. Pinker's happy data are not wrong, and neither are various kinds of encouraging economic indicators. But if those don't really explain the reigning sentiments of our time, then we have to ask ourselves what those kinds of indicators might ignore, what signs we might be missing. Our usual measures of wealth and health and personal freedom don't really explain the problem because those familiar indicators, as important as they are largely material and individual. They assess our well being on our own, but none of us can actually experience well being on our own. It's in the joints of society, at the junctures of individual, where we encounter one another, that the trouble has really shown itself. One way to put that is that many of our struggles seem like they're rooted in relational problems. Loneliness and isolation, mistrust, suspicion, alienation, polarization. These are the problems we have now, and they're failures of sociality so that they can fall into a blind spot for our very individualist culture. So, how do we explain then a crisis of connectedness? Some people argue that the trouble is philosophical, almost metaphysical, that liberalism has failed because it fails to offer us a sufficient vocabulary and architecture for solidarity. Other people say that although traditional kinds of measures of growth or prosperity look okay, our problem is actually still economic in a deeper sense. It's somehow socioeconomic. They say that contemporary capitalism creates levels of inequality that make it impossible for people to feel like equal parts of a larger society or to believe in the legitimacy of our political order or economic order. Other people will say that external pressures like trade or immigration or internal pressures like racism or wokeism have left us just unable to hang together. I think there's actually some truth to all of these explanations. They get at something important because they treat the human person as embedded in a larger whole, whether that's metaphysical or moral or social or economic. And they see that what's gone wrong has to do with the way in which we now live out that embeddedness. But I think they're still missing something very important. When we think about our problems in these ways, we tend to imagine our society as a big open space filled with people who are having trouble connecting. And so we talk about breaking down walls or building bridges or leveling playing fields. But there's a missing step, I think, between joining together and actually recovering belonging and trust and legitimacy. What we're missing, though we too rarely put it this way, is not just connectedness, but a structure of social life, a way to give shape and purpose and concrete meaning to the things that we do together. If American life is a big open space, it's not just a space filled with individuals. It's a space filled with these structures of social life. It's a space filled with institutions. And if we're too often failing to foster belonging and legitimacy and trust, then more than just a failure of connection, we're living through a failure of institutions. Institutions do a lot more than connect us. And understanding our social crisis in terms of what they are and what they do could really help us to see that crisis in a new light. So, what is an institution? It wouldn't surprise you to learn that there are lots and lots of different academic definitions of the term. But for our purposes at the moment, let me suggest a general definition that draws together a lot of that academic work, but also looks to the problems that we particularly confront now in our society. By institutions, I mean the durable forms of our common life, the shapes and structures of what we do together. Some institutions are organizations. They have something like a corporate form. A university or a hospital or a business or a civic organization are all institutions. They're technically legally formalized. Some institutions are durable forms of a different kind. Maybe they're shaped by laws or by norms or rules, but they don't have that kind of technical corporate structure. The family is an institution. In fact, it's the first and foremost institution of any society. We can talk about the institution of marriage or a particular tradition or profession as an institution, the rule of law. That they're durable is one essential thing about them. An institution keeps its general shape over time, it changes slowly, and so it shapes the realm of life in which it actually functions. Flash mobs are not institutions. But most important, what's distinct about an institution is that it is a form. In the deepest sense, a form is a structure, a contour. It's the shape of the whole, the organization that speaks of its purpose and its logic and function and meaning. A social form, an institution, is not just a bunch of people. It's a bunch of people who are ordered together to achieve a purpose, to pursue a goal or advance an ideal. And that means that institutions, by their nature, are also formative. They structure our interactions with one another, and as a result, they structure us. They shape our habits, our expectations. Ultimately, they shape our character, they shape our soul, they help to form us. And that formative role actually has a lot to do with how institutions relate to the kind of social crisis that we're living through. Let me say a word about how. When we think about the role of institutions in American life now, we might tend to think first in terms of our loss of trust or confidence in them. And that's a trend that we hear a lot about. Measures of loss of trust in institutions are very easy to find. They paint a very grim picture. Gallup has kept track of what it calls Americans' confidence in institutions since 1973. And the trend in those figures is pretty amazing. From big business and banks and the professions to the branches of the federal government, the news media, the academy, it's found that confidence in our institutions has been plummeting consistently. In the early 1970s, 80% of Americans said that they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in doctors and hospitals, for example. Last year, the figure was 37%. 40 years ago, 65% of Americans said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in organized religion. Last year, that figure was 32%. In the early 1970s, you could find large numbers of Americans expressing a lot of trust in government. So, for example, even in 1975, a year after Richard Nixon's resignation, 52% of Americans expressed a lot of confidence in the presidency. Last year, 32% said so. Gallup even found that more than 40% of Americans had confidence in Congress in the 1970s. Last year, that figure was 12%. Even that, frankly, seems high. You kind of have to wonder who those people are. That pattern holds for just about every institution that Gallup asks about. The military is the one major exception, and we'll think a little bit about why that is. But the overall trend is really unmistakable. The American public has gone from extraordinary levels of confidence in our major institutions to really striking levels of mistrust. But what do we actually mean when we say we don't trust institutions? The answer, I think, has a lot to do with what institutions really are and do, and it takes us back to that question of how they form us. Every significant institution carries out some important task in our society, maybe educating children or enforcing the law, serving the poor, or providing some kind of service, maybe just making some product or meeting a need. And it does that by establishing a structure and a process, again, a form for combining people's efforts toward accomplishing that task. And in the process, the institution also forms those people to carry out that work effectively, responsibly, reliably. It shapes the people within it to be more trustworthy. And that's actually what we mean, I think, when we say we trust an institution. We trust an institution when it seems to have an ethic that makes the people in it more trustworthy. And so we might trust political institutions when they seem to take seriously some obligation to the public interest and they form the people in them to do the same. We trust the military because it values courage and honor and duty in carrying out the defense of the nation, and it shapes people who do too. We trust a business because it promises quality and integrity in meeting some need that we have, and it seems like it rewards its people when they deliver those. We trust a journalistic institution, if you can think back to when you trusted a journalistic institution, because it has high standards of honesty or accuracy in reporting the news that make its people worthy of being trusted. An institution in this sense shapes a certain kind of person in line with the work that the institution does. Imagine you're talking to someone for a while, then you ask them what he does, and he says, I'm an accountant. And you think to yourself, yeah, that makes sense. This guy's an accountant. What are you really saying in that moment? You're saying there's such a thing in the world as an accountant, shaped by the ethos of that profession, formed in its mold. We lose faith in an institution when we no longer believe that it can play that kind of ethical or formative role, that it shapes the people in it to be trustworthy. And one way that can happen is when institutions claim to enforce an ethic of responsibility, but just plainly fail to do that and end up instead shielding misbehavior. Like when a bank cheats its customers, it becomes impossible to trust. I think above all, I was speaking about the ways in which ultimately institutions form people to be trustworthy and cause us to lose trust when they seem not to form people to be trustworthy. One way in which that can happen is just corruption, is just people abusing the power they have within an institution. But another related but different way in which an institution can lose our trust seems to me to be more important for thinking about our contemporary social crisis. We certainly have more than our share of traditional corruption now, but corruption's always been with us, and it doesn't really explain the distinct decline in institutional trust that we have seen in our time. Um, the other related but different way in which an institution can lose our trust, though, is when it simply fails to impose an ethic on the people within it altogether, and so doesn't really even seem to see that kind of formation as its purpose. When the people in that institution no longer really see it as a mold of their character and behavior at all, but just as a platform for themselves to perform on, to raise their profiles and be seen. An institution like that seems not to be worthy of our trust, not because it's failed to earn it exactly, but because it seems not even to be asking for it, not even to be interested in it. And something like that, I think, has been happening to a great many of our institutions in recent decades in particular. When we don't think of our institutions as formative, but as performative, when the presidency and Congress are just stages for performative outrage, when a university becomes just a venue for virtue signaling, when journalism is indistinguishable from activism, when the church becomes a political stage, they all become harder to trust. They're not really asking for our trust, they're just asking for our attention. And in our time, I think many of our most significant social and political and cultural institutions are in the process of going through that kind of transformation from mold to platform, from shaping people to operate in the world in a certain way, to providing people with platforms as individuals from which they can be seen and heard by more people. The few exceptions to that, again, maybe most notably the military, the most unabashedly formative of our national institutions, tend to prove the rule because they tend to be the few institutions in which we're not losing faith as quickly. And many of the genuinely novel institutions of the 21st century, like social media, are inherently shaped as platforms and not as molds. It would be strange to trust a platform, and we generally don't. That kind of change of attitude, that decline in the expectation that our institutions should be formative, is at the heart of our loss of trust in institutions. And it's in turn at the heart of our broader social crisis, too, because institutions understood as platforms rather than as molds of character, as stages to perform on rather than as a means to shape us, are less able to offer us objects of loyalty and legitimacy and and ways of building mutual trust. Examples of that kind of transformation from mold to platform are really just everywhere around us now. And in a lot of cases, our institutions are being made into platforms not just for any kind of performance, but for performative virtue and performative outrage in our in our vast and polarized culture. In one institution after another, we find people who should think of themselves as insiders shaped by the distinct purpose and integrity of the institution, functioning instead as outsiders, displaying themselves and building their own personal brand. That's obvious in politics, right? Is there really any question now that a lot of people who run for Congress, for example, run less to be involved in legislative work and more to have a prominent platform in the culture war, to become more visible on cable news or talk radio, to build a bigger social media following, to use their elected office mostly as a platform, and often to complain about the very institution that they worked so hard to enter. They see that as what their voters want. They're always performing for that core partisan audience. Is there any question that the political parties have become really just platforms, stages for narcissistic celebrities to perform on? Both parties. But look beyond politics too. Think about the profession of journalism as an example. Its institutional strength is its insistence on a kind of formative integrity, on a process of editing and verification that can help us to be sure that what it provides us is reasonably reliable. But today, a lot of elite journalists constantly step outside of those institutional constraints and address the public directly on social media, on cable news, building their own personal brands on a platform rather than participating in the work of an institution. If you check in on Twitter right now, you'll find countless professional journalists deprofessionalizing themselves systematically. You can see the same pattern in the academy. Rather than serving the institutional purpose of a university, which is to form some portion of the rising generation through teaching and learning, we find many in the university using the institution as a platform for political and culture war theatrics. There's a version of the same kind of pattern in American religion, where some institutions that exist to form and transform souls are being used instead as platforms for political drama, so that the cachet of the church is used less to form the people within it than to let them express themselves. We see that pattern throughout American life. That kind of distortion of institutionalism amounts in practical terms, I think, to a failure to ask a core question, the great unasked question of our time. Given my role here, how should I behave? That is what somebody who takes an institution that they're involved with seriously would ask. And a lot of the trouble facing our core institutions now might be described as a widespread failure to ask that question. Given my role here, how should I behave? As a president or a member of Congress, as a teacher or a scientist or a worker or a parent or a neighbor, given that role, what should I do here? I would bet that the people that you most respect these days seem to ask that kind of question before they make an important judgment. And that the people who most drive you crazy, who you really think are part of the problem, seem to fail to ask that question when they really should. That is one way to understand the transformation of our expectations of institutions, which has a lot to do with the broader set of problems that our society has been dealing with. That transformation has left a lot of Americans with a sense that our institutions can't be trusted, that they are not in the business of earning trust. And that has left us short of sources of formation and belonging and legitimacy and social cohesion. That problem doesn't simply explain the social crisis that we're living through, of course, but it's one important factor behind what we confront, and one that we're particularly likely to miss or to ignore because we aren't very good at seeing institutions, at grasping what they're for. So, what can we do about it? Obviously, there's no simple answer to that question, no policy agenda that can just give us a to do list. But I think dealing with this kind of problem requires to begin with a change of mindset. Witnessing failures of responsibility in so many of our institutions, we're tempted to a disposition to demolish, to uproot, and we're tempted to conclude that only outsiders can save us. That's, I think, why so much of the energy of our politics is spent tearing down supposedly powerful establishments. But in fact, I think we don't just need more outsiders who pretend that they're just critics with no power to act. We actually need some more insiders, institutionalists who will be earnest both in their efforts to build frameworks for common action and in their acceptance of the duties and responsibilities that come with power in various institutions. Those in our society who have the most power, our leaders, our elites, need especially to resist the urge that they are outsiders, as they do too often now. But everybody else does too. Instead, we should try to embrace the responsibilities that come with whatever kinds of positions we hold. And we should ensure that obligations and restraints actually protect and empower us. We need to inhabit the institutions that we're part of, to love them, to, where necessary, reform them, to help them be more lovely to other people too. We need to understand ourselves as formed by these institutions and to act accordingly. And so, again, in moments of decision, to ask ourselves not just what do I want, but what should I do here given the role I have or the position I have? Questions like that can seem awfully small as a response to the enormous sorts of social problems that I started with. And of course, they would only be a start, but they are how we can begin to work toward a change of mindset, and they can add up and make a difference. If our leaders asked them more often, our politics would be improved a lot. If professionals in a lot of fields thought this way a little more, it would be easier to trust their expertise, to accept their claims to authority, which we have a lot of trouble doing right now, and rightly so. If the people who participate in all the institutions that we're part of tried to think this way a little bit more, it would be easier to feel like we belong to something that is worthwhile. Now, that kind of change of mindset is not a substitute for institutional reform, but I do think that it's an essential prerequisite for it. And we do need some institutional reforms. I want to be clear that I don't think the problem to be solved is that people don't trust institutions. The problem to be solved is that many of our institutions are not trustworthy enough. It's also important to recognize that there are some serious reasons to be careful and skeptical about institutional power. There are obviously a lot of ways in which institutions can be oppressive and constraining. The disposition against strong institutions arose for a reason, and the arguments for transparency and for individualism arose as correctives to excessively rigid, excessively imperious institutions. Those kinds of worries are serious, but we have also to see that populism and individualism and various kinds of anti-institutional forces in our society now involve serious trade-offs. Institutions can be oppressive, but we cannot do without them. And in fact, they are most important to people in our society who don't have a lot of power. So that if our institutions break down, people who are in positions of strength or in positions of power or wealth are going to be just fine. It's the people who are in positions of weakness in various places in our society who most need functional institutions. And so who ultimately most need the work involved in helping our institutions recover. I think that's part of the irony that we confront in this moment. The failures of our institutions have led us to demand that they be uprooted or demolished, but we can't address those failures without renewing and rebuilding those very institutions. It makes sense to resist the excessive strength of some institutions, but our problems now have a lot more to do with excessive weakness in institutions, and they require recommitment and reform more than resentment. In one arena after another of American life, we face the challenge now of drawing alienated people back into our institutions. We can point to all kinds of complicated theories about how to build trust and restore the kind of confidence that will be required to accomplish that. But the simplest way to build trust is for the people who inhabit our institutions, that is, for all of us, to work at being a little more trustworthy. It's something all of us in various ways can do. We can give our institutional responsibilities a little more of our time and effort. We can give them more of our identity and self-consciousness. We can understand ourselves as defined by the institutions that matter most to us in our lives, judge ourselves by their standards a little more, hold ourselves up to their ideals, take them seriously. We can work to reform them when they're failing, to help them work better, be more worthy of confidence. And we can yearn ourselves not for the formless autonomy of the independent contractor, but for the rootedness and responsibility of the member and the partner and the worker and the owner and the citizen. There's a word for that kind of attitude. The word is devotion. What's required of each of us now is more devotion to the work that we do together and to the aspirations we share in common, and ultimately to the institutions that embody those aspirations. That kind of devotion calls for sacrifice, for commitment. It calls on each of us to pledge ourselves to some institution that we belong to unabashedly, to abandon ironic distance and jump in. And that kind of devotion, I think, is not only necessary, it's actually very attractive right now. We want objects of devotion, we want something to commit to. But we often don't see that what we're looking for is right within our reach. It's easy to be fashionable rebels in a moment like this. It's harder to remind ourselves why our core commitments are worthwhile. That is the kind of case that institutionalism involves now, and it's a crucial case. In the wake of the last several years, we can see the contours of the problem especially clearly. We can see why it's hard to trust expertise, but also why we need expertise. We can see why people recoil from claims to authority, but also why we need authoritative institutions and leaders we can rely on at some level. It's not easy to see how to escape the kind of contradiction that this challenge presents, but I want to suggest to you that the way out of it is to see that what we really require is a change of mindset, a recovery of responsibility, and that we each can be part of that. It's not just something other people need to do. Thinking and speaking just a little differently about the things we do together through the institutions we belong to can make a bigger difference than we might imagine. And that, in the end, is the character of the kind of transformation that we need. The demolition crews have been allowed to define the spirit of this era for long enough. But where we're headed ultimately will be up to the builders and rebuilders. And that's what each of us should seek to be. I'll end there. Thank you.
Well, Yuval, thank you very much for wonderful ideas for this President's Day. Look, one questioner, I'm going to go right to the questions, asked almost a religious question, but you have used on occasion religious terminology in talking about the soul.
Yes.
We live in a largely secular time where the question of the soul is problematic for people. You also use the word devotion, which also suggests something that's more than the ordinary. So
Right.
one person starts off, is it more commendable to naturally possess virtuous qualities that you hope people are going to have, or to develop them somehow through personal struggles and overcoming less desirable traits?
It's a very interesting question. I think the two are very hard to separate. I mean, I would say that um, the kind of view that I advanced here and that I would advance in general begins from the premise that the human being always starts out fallen and imperfect, even as we are an extraordinary creature of incredible dignity. And that is a religious idea, without question. It's an idea that suggests that we all require a lot of formation before we're ready to be free and flourishing, before we're ready to be citizens of a complicated society like this. That everybody does. I'd say an American citizen is not a natural artifact. It's not something that falls from a tree. It's something that is created by the institutions of a society. And I think that's true of any functional society. Um, that means that we require strong, effective, functional institutions. I would say, by the way, institutions evolved gradually over time to achieve this purpose. In order for us to be able to flourish. And, some people do start out, I suppose, better naturally endowed to be flourishing people and some not, but none of us starts out ready. And I don't think there's anybody who just simply doesn't need the kind of work that the family does, that that school does, that working cultural institutions do. That's what culture is for. It's there to meet us where we start, which is where every generation of human beings has always started, and to bring us up to the level of our civilization. That is hard work. It requires everyone in our society, in one way or another, to take a part in. And I think that there's no escaping that work, and we can never expect people to just start out ready and not need that kind of formation. So I guess I'd say ultimately, however virtuous we begin, we have a lot of work to do. And that work is culture forming work that requires certain sorts of institutions.
Occurs to me that a word for that is socialization, isn't it? That's what the social scientists would
That's
use,
right.
how to become part of our culture. So here's another question that I think goes to another issue. So it's one of community that you've described. That was a
Mm,
word you utilized.
yeah.
There are, of course, many, and that includes neighborhood. So he says, during my childhood, I constantly experienced the feeling of belonging to a community. I had a close relationship with all my neighbors. Currently, I believe that this sense of community is absent. I'd like to know your thoughts on the reasons behind this absence and any suggestions you have for its revival.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of people have that sense. It's not true everywhere. I can tell you, for example, that I am very fortunate to live in a place where my kids are growing up really in a very robust community with a lot of the kinds of neighbors and friends and freedom to play outside that we all wish every child could have. It does exist, but I do think that it is available now to fewer people in our society. And I think a lot of that has had to do with a decline of trust that Americans have in one another. There's just less of a sense that you live in a place where everybody's engaged in the same work and the same effort. It is definitely true, and there's a lot of evidence for this, that Americans tend to know fewer of their neighbors now, and tend to rely less on what we would think of as the neighborhood for meeting the basic needs involved in raising a family. I think part of what's involved in of what would be required to bring people more into the fold of neighborhood is actually very practical in that sense, is to rely more on people around you to meet the kinds of basic needs you have when you're raising children. I think in some ways our society has become better at meeting those needs in other ways. Both government and markets have crowded out a lot of the work of neighborhoods, have made them less necessary, and therefore also less relied upon. I think that's true of a lot of the institutions of our civil society, by the way, so that the greater efficiency of various kinds of market services and the deeper involvement of government in providing social services, both of which are there for a reason, have had a very detrimental effect on the strength of our civil society institutions. There's a saying in sociology that people don't come together to be together. People come together to do something together. And so you're not drawn into an institution that isn't offering you something to do or something you need. And so as the traditional institutions of civil society are less a part of how we find work or meet our spouse or find care for our kids, those institutions grow weaker. And there's no question that we've seen that happen in American life over the past half century and more.
Hmm. I'm going to combine both a comment or question of mine with another question here. A number of your comments um, essentially go to how we function in the arts. You talked about performative aspects of our culture now. Of course, performers perform.
Yep.
You talked about a stage or a staging area now. Well, of course, orchestras and soloists perform on a stage. Now, in those cases, the performer, and here's now a problem, we could even bring in a philosopher like Roger Scruton, who talks about the differences between the performative aspects of rock and roll as opposed to classical music, where
Yep.
rock and roll, the performer is being performative. It's about them and what they're doing as much or more than it is about the music that they are in fact performing. In classical music, of course, the performers generally are a conduit for something that we consider great, whether it's the performance of a Copland clarinet concerto or the performance of a Rachmaninoff symphony. So one of our questioners also says, do you think that cultural and art institutions are trusted more or less than political and economic institutions? So we could talk about what's happened to our art institutions.
Yeah.
For example, I mean, Heather McDonald has commented on the problems of almost all art institutions being taken over now by a particular agenda rather than that of transmitting as the performer does in the classical music tradition.
Absolutely.
I'll leave that to you to parse and figure out how you might want
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question, and I think it really gets to the core of what is wrong with a certain kind of performative institutionalism now. I would say that when you distinguish formative from performative is when you distinguish the kind of institutional breakdown we're witnessing from what cultural institutions at their best do, right? Great music and art are precisely formative. They are there to shape your soul in light of the truth. That's what beauty does. What we're finding in a lot of institutions instead is that people want to participate as people want to participate in the expression of political ideas and especially of anger from everywhere. They want to use every institution as the same kind of platform for culture war performance, so that everywhere just becomes a place to stand and yell about the other party. And wherever you are, whether that is a business that needs the trust of the public, whether that's a government institution, whether that's a school, whether that's a professional institution, you just use it as a place to stand and yell about politics. And that's certainly happening in the culture as well. And a lot of art institutions now understand themselves also as being in the business of just conveying political messages. And precisely the same deformation that happens when when the phone company decides to tell you what it thinks about abortion, as if you need to know that, and when a member of Congress, rather than participating in the negotiative work of the institution, uses it simply as a place to stand and yell about the other party, the same thing is now happening on stages that are meant to be stages, on platforms for art and culture. And I think it has the same deformative effect. It becomes impossible to take art seriously when it's the shallowest kind of political expression, where it just becomes another way to say the same thing everybody is saying everywhere else. So I think what we see in the deformation of professional culture, what we see when journalism just becomes activism, what we see when a university campus just becomes a place to stand and yell rather than teach and learn, is exactly what we also see when the stage that is meant to be a performative space for soul-forming work of art becomes instead an expressive space for politics. Now, politics has its place. It's important, but it can't be the only thing our society does. And I think that as it becomes that, it does increasingly become difficult for Americans to trust each other and to take each other seriously. And that is happening around art. I have to say, there has been a growing sense among a lot of Americans that artists are just, they're just virtue signaling. And too often that is true. It's obviously not always true, but the more it happens, the more difficult it becomes to take seriously the extremely serious work of culture and art.
Seems to me that partly what you were saying, that we're having trouble with people essentially staying in their own lane, as it were. In other words, it would be nice if artists created art that was about what art is supposedly about, which is beauty.
Yeah,
It would be
absolutely.
if doctors would stay in their lane about doctoring rather than about doctoring within a particular political context.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah,
that
and when you think about the trust problem, I think that's exactly where a lot of it has gone wrong. So that in the midst of the COVID pandemic, to have a large group of public health professionals say that, although you can't go to your grandmother's funeral, you're allowed to have a protest about police brutality. That is a way of making yourself ridiculous as a professional. And it has to be possible for people to say, I have my views. I will express those when it's appropriate as a citizen. But as a physician or as a teacher or as an artist, this is what I do. And it's not all the same thing. I'll tell you a strange story about this. A few years ago, I watched the wonderful ESPN documentary about Michael Jordan. It's called The Last Dance. And in the course of it, this has nothing to do with anything. There's an incident in the early 1990s where Michael Jordan was asked by a candidate for the Senate in North Carolina, his home state, to endorse him because Michael Jordan had actually sent this person a check without any kind of public notice. And the person said, well, you're giving me money, you support me, so why don't you come out and say Michael Jordan wants you to vote for this guy? And Jordan said no. And he didn't just say no. He said, I'm what I do, the reason why I'm a celebrity is that I'm an athlete. And ultimately, there's no reason why anybody should care who I'm voting for. And then he said an additional reason for not doing it is that Republicans buy sneakers too. And Jordan got into some trouble for this because it seems cynical. It seems like, well, he doesn't want to hurt his financial base. But hearing that through these 30 years that we've lived through, hearing him say that in the 1990s, I think Republicans buy sneakers too is actually a beautiful expression of a very important point that we can't all constantly treat each other purely as political actors. We engage with each other as citizens. We relate to each other in other ways, and we can disagree about politics in the appropriate venues for that. But we also have to live with each other all the time, despite those disagreements. And part of what that requires is that we do have our lanes, and that the most popular basketball player in the world can just say, I don't want to express my political views in public. That would only undermine what we're doing here. He was absolutely right. And I think a lot of people could learn from that example now.
it occurs to me, there's a comment by the wonderful philosopher Michael Oakeshott, who was asked something about something. And he said, I just don't know enough about that to come up with a strong answer. And therefore, I will not answer that question. Maybe that should be something that other people in our society live by, that because
Yeah.
they know about something in one sphere, doesn't they know a lot about something in something else and perhaps should simply not comment. So this is appropriate for today. Do you think our founding fathers would be proud of the outcome of where we are today in America?
Well, look, in a lot of ways, yes, absolutely. I think they would have been amazed that the system they created is still here. 230 something years after the Constitution, almost 250 years after the Declaration of Independence. The idea that our country not only is still here, but it is incredibly strong and prosperous and successful. We also do have tremendous problems. And I think that those problems would not have shocked them. They're problems that result from precisely the perception of human nature that so many of the framers of our Constitution had. They understood that people are always going to act in self-interested ways, in factional ways, that people are always going to be human beings. But they thought that there was a way for a certain arrangement of political institutions to help us become a little better than that and to work together even when we don't always think alike. To me, that's the magic of the free society. The meaning of unity, of political unity in a free and diverse society. Unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And how do we act together when we don't think alike is the question to which our system of government is an answer. I think it is a brilliant answer that it remains so. And I think they would find a lot to be very impressed with in our times, but there would also be more than a little that they would shake their heads at and wonder at. And I think the best of them would see the ways in which a more functional politics could be achieved if our society understood its problems in the right way. And I think that remains true. A lot of what we're doing is what they were doing, and we can learn a lot from them in it. I would say it's particularly true in the case of George Washington, who we celebrate today. I've never liked to say President's Day. The official federal holiday actually is just George Washington's birthday. And I think we're better off celebrating him than imagining that, Chester Arthur deserves his own day. What we can really learn from George Washington has a lot to do with what we were just talking about here. It has to do with the power that comes from self-restraint. It has to do with the way in which being responsible and acting your role can allow you to do extraordinary things while respecting people's freedom and dignity. I think more than any of the leaders of that founding generation, George Washington, who just constantly found himself in jobs that nobody had ever had before, over and over, really understood what it meant to be an institutional leader. And I think we just have so much to learn from him.
I'm reminded of two things, which I'll simply relate rather quickly as we close. One, he wrote a wonderful letter to, of course, one of the first Jewish communities in Providence, Rhode Island, saying, "We welcome you, our Jewish population, as full citizens in the United States of America," which was, well, not always done in Europe.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. Washington said in that letter, "We don't tolerate Jews. We consider you equals." And I've always been amazed by how he could think about that question in the 18th century.
That's correct. And what you I think are leading us to also is he stepped down as general, he became president, and at a certain point he could have continued being president for a very long time, couldn't he? There were no rules about not having a third term, and he said, "No, enough is enough. And now get another president." He could have been a king. He could have continued on. So your comments about him are wonderful. Finally, one other speaker that we've had who is almost as eminent as you made a comment about our political wars. He said, each side fights as if it wants to be the sole party. If you were the sole party to make decisions, you would not have a democracy. And one of the great things about our institutions that allows us to fight, scream at each other, if that's what it has to be. I wish it weren't that, but to argue and to find commonality in the end in being American citizens, where we can have these arguments and not kill each other over them, but rather have a strong functioning society that tolerates other opinions.
Absolutely.
We are out of time. And therefore, I will close this by simply thanking you very, very much for being our speaker today. You've raised some wonderful questions, wonderful ideas for all of us on this President's Day, and we thank you.
Well, I thank you too, and I want to really apologize for the 2 interruptions there that were my fault technologically. So please forgive me, and thank you for this chance.
I want you to know you are forgiven. You should not lose sleep tonight over it. This happens in our new technological environment. Thanks so much, and thank you to everybody who joined us. And we'll see you at our next event, which you will be hearing about. We'll be joined by the wonderful conductor, Marin Alsop. Marin was the principal and conductor of the Baltimore Symphony for many years, is now the conductor of the Vienna Radio Orchestra, and she will be talking to us about her views on how we might wish to respond in this day and age in our new time of political correctness. We'll see what she has to say. Thank you for joining us. Good night, wherever you are. Bye-bye.